The galaxy is not simply a battlefield of guns, blades, and it is a theater of wills, where the greatest wars are waged, not over territory or resources, but over the minds of those who march into slaughter. Armies do not fight alone. They fight with their fears, their hungers, their pride, and their despair. And it is in these fragile currents of thought and faith that the Chaos Gods find their dominion. To gaze into their influence is to watch entire legions unravel, not because they were weak, but because weakness was given shape, voice, and weapon. What you are about to hear is not just the story of how mortals fight. Chaos, it is the story of how chaos makes mortals fight for it. And before we descend into this abyss together, if this exploration of Warhammer 40K's most insidious truths holds you in its grip, consider lending strength to this channel. Like, share, and subscribe so that this lore may spread as far as the whispers of the warp itself. Now, let us begin. The mud had no mercy. It clung to boots until each step felt like dragging a corpse, seeping into gloves, into rations, into the cracks of lazarefuls where grit would fuse with sweat and form a crust that never washed away. The trenches smelled of damp iron and burnt promethium, a stench that settled into the lungs until every breath carried the weight of death. In such a place, where men of the Astra Militarum waited between barrages, the silence could kill more surely than a bolter round. It was in that silence that the first whispers came. The soldier whose ear caught them did not know his name would one day vanish from all records, replaced by numbers or omitted entirely. At that moment, he was just another man pressed into the Emperor's service, half-starved, half-asleep, clinging to the stock of his weapon like it could hold him in place. He thought the sound was the rustle of a rat moving through sandbags, or the groan of the trench walls settling, but it spoke again, soft and deliberate, brushing against his thoughts like breath across the skin. It did not command. It did not threaten. It promised. In the beginning the words were small, harmless. They carried the shape of what he already longed to hear. That he would see his home again. That his brother had not died screaming in the last advance. That there was still meaning in spilling blood for men who would never know his name. It was not foreign. It was familiar. The whisper knew him, because it wore his own voice, only calmer, more certain, more kind. Sleep in the trenches was not real sleep. It came in gasps, in stolen minutes between artillery howls, in dreams snapped apart by the screech of incoming shells. Yet, even in that broken rest, the whisper lingered. It threaded into his dreams, reshaping the battlefield into something brighter. The mud was gone. The sky was clean. The enemy's fire missed every shot, and his comrades cheered as though he were more than just a man in the line. It was not victory, it was release. And when he woke, for a moment, he believed it might be possible. Hope in war is dangerous. It can stiffen spines, but it can also open the soul to voices that should never be heard. Around him, the regiment muttered prayers to the God Emperor, words worn smooth by repetition until they no longer pierced the heart. They were habit, nothing more. The whisper was not habit. It was intimate. It pressed into him like a confidant, not a distant god enthroned on Terra. And in the stillness of the trench, what soldier would not lean toward a voice that felt closer than the stars? It began to shape his perception. The commissar's bark no longer sounded like authority but like cruelty. The sergeant's orders felt not protective, but wasteful. Why charge into fire for ground that would be lost tomorrow? Why bleed for officers who ate better meals behind the lines? The whisper did not demand rebellion. It merely asked questions he already carried in his bones. Each question was a seed, watered by the soldier's own resentment, until obedience began to rot at the root. When the shells came again, the trench shuddered under the force. Men screamed as dirt collapsed, burying them alive. The soldier clawed himself free, ears ringing, eyes blurred with soil. Through the chaos, he thought he heard it again, clearer this time. Words shaped like certainty. You do not have to die for them. His las rifle felt heavy in his hands, heavier than before, as if the weapon itself knew the truth. And when he fired, he imagined not for long, not fully but imagined, that the beam cut not into the enemy, but into the men who had dragged him into this war. No one noticed yet. No one saw the shift behind his eyes. Soldiers in war are ghosts even before they fall, and a ghost can change shape without being recognized. But the whisper did not remain as alone. It carried. In the dugout at night, others stirred, turning their heads like animals catching a scent. One muttered that he had dreamed of his dead wife's face, calling him home. Another swore he heard their slain captain's voice, telling him to stand down. They laughed it off at first, the way soldiers laugh at anything that frightens them. Yet the laughter was thin. They all knew. Something was walking the trench line, and it was not wearing boots. The strength of chaos is not in overwhelming force, but in patience. A single whisper, repeated often enough, becomes memory. Memory becomes truth. Truth becomes faith. And once faith shifts, no bolt gun or chainsword can repair it. The soldier who first heard it began to linger when others charged. His shots fired a heartbeat slower, his aim a fraction lower. No one called him a traitor. Not yet. But the whisper praised him. And that praise filled the emptiness no prayer to the Emperor ever had. When morning came, the fog clung low to the mud, and the regiment was ordered forward once more. The soldier climbed from the trench, mud dripping from his boots, laskin trembling in his grip. He looked across the blasted field and thought of nothing but the voice. It did not tell him to desert. It did not tell him to betray. It simply reminded him, you do not have to die for them. He repeated it to himself as he marched. Each step was not loyalty. Each step was bargaining. Each step was one more line erased from the oath he had once sworn. And when the guns roared, and comrades fell screaming into the earth, he did not hear their cries as calls for help. He heard them as confirmation. Confirmation that the whisper was right, that there was another way, that survival, not duty, was the true victory. In that moment, before anyone else could see, before any mark of mutation or blasphemy appeared, the regiment had already begun to fracture. Not because a demon had appeared, not because sorcery had split the sky, but because one man had listened and found the words inside his head more convincing than the orders barked outside it. The whisper had taken root, the trench had shifted, and the first war was already lost. The banners stood taller than the men who bore them. In the smoke and ash of the battlefield, they rose above mud, above corpses, above the broken steel husks of tanks. For soldiers of the Astra Militarum, the banner was more than fabric and pullet, was anchor and compass, the proof that the regiment still lived. When the roar of less fire deafened ears, and the blast of ordnance left eyes blinded, a man could still look to the standard and know which way to face, which way to charge, which way to die. But symbols are more fragile than flesh, and chaos knows how to wound what cannot bleed. The first sign was subtle, a torn edge that refused repair, a fray that spread faster than any needle could mend. The standard-bearer swore he stitched it, swore he patched the seam himself, yet by dawn the wound was larger. At first the men laughed, calling it luck, calling it superstition, yet none of them touched it again. Their eyes lingered too long, as if the rip was not cloth but a mouth waiting to widen. Soon, the colors began to change. In daylight, the banner still held its scarlet and gold, its imperial aquila proud in the center. But in shadow, in the moments just before dusk, the wings darkened. Black spread from the fabric's heart like oil, dripping into the threads until the aquila seemed less a symbol of terra and more a carrion bird, talons slick with rot. The soldiers whispered that the Emperor still watched them, but not with pride, with hunger. On the third day, the first ichor fell. The bearer woke to find his hand sticky, the pole damp as if it had been dragged through blood. No wound on the men explained it, no slaughter in the night accounted for the stain. It seeped from the cloth itself, thick and slow, trailing down into the mud where it did not soak, but writhed. The men backed away, crossing themselves with hurried prayers. Yet none dared leave the banner behind. To march without it would mean death by Commissar's bolt. To carry it meant death by something unseen. Morale bends quicker than steel. The banner no longer rallied courage. It demanded fear. Men looked upon it and remembered their sins, their oaths broken in whispers and in thought. One swore he heard his mother's scream in the flapping of its folds. Another claimed the Aquila blinked when he was not watching. Jests turned to silence. Songs in the dugouts turned to mutters. And when the officers raised the standard to call the charge, the soldiers did not surge forward. They hesitated, as if running not toward the enemy, but toward the maw painted on the cloth. The bearer himself changed. His voice, once loud and sure, grew quiet. His hands shook even when no shell fell. He slept less, ate less, his eyes hollowing as though the banner consumed him. Some swore they saw the ichor drip from his mouth as well, as if he had begun to share in its bleeding. When asked what plagued him, he only whispered that the banner was heavier each day, though no mortal hand could feel its weight. It was in battle that the truth revealed itself. Under fire, when the las guns cracked and the voxcasters screamed orders, the banner tore open, not from shot or shell, but from within. The Aquila split, its wings curling, its beak stretched wide. No wind touched it, yet it flapped violently, shrieking in silence. The men who saw it broke. Some threw themselves to the mud, clawing at their helmets, as if to scrape away the vision. Others turned their rifles on comrades, screaming that traitors surrounded them. The banner had ceased to be a symbol of unity. It was now a blade, cleaving brother from brother, and yet none dared destroy it. Commissars leveled their pistols, intent on purging the corruption, but their shots never struck true. The banner swayed aside, or the lasbolt veered in impossible arcs, burning harmlessly into soil. In time, even the most devout officers lowered their arms, unwilling to face the weight of what stood before them. The cloth was no longer fabric, it was a sign, and signs, in the Imperium, are not questioned, they are obeyed. Even when they lead to ruin, what had once been the rally point became the curse of the regiment. Soldiers stumbled into fire because they followed its sway. Platoons broke formation because they fled from its shadow. The ichor spread, staining uniforms, staining rations, staining even the water in canteens, until every taste was sour. The men were not simply fighting the enemy across the trench. They were fighting the banner above their own heads, and losing. One night, a guardsman tried to burn it. He crept close with a torch stolen from a munitions cache, whispering the Emperor's name through clenched teeth. Flames caught, bright and desperate, but the fire bent backward, flowing up his arms, devouring him whole before it touched the fabric. When morning came, nothing remained of him but charred bones at the banner's base. The standard stood untouched, fluttering faintly, though no breeze stirred. The regiment took the message. None tried again. By then, the banner no longer needed to bleed. The men did it for themselves. They marched with hollow eyes, saluted with trembling hands, and when the order came to charge, they ran not to victory, but to escape its gaze. Their deaths fed its folds, each life a thread woven deeper into the pattern until the Aquila was gone, replaced by shapes no one dared name. In war, men die for banners because they believe the banner will outlive them. Under chaos, banners outlive men because they drink them dry. And so the regiment did not end in defeat, but in silence. When Imperial reinforcements found the field weeks later, they discovered only the banner standing upright in the windless dusk, surrounded by empty uniforms and broken rifles. No bodies remained, no voices remained, only a symbol that had bled them all away. The general knelt alone in the command chamber, his knees pressed into the steel grating until they bled through his uniform. Around him the walls hummed with the constant murmur of cogitators and the faint crackle of the vox, voices of adjutants and tacticians muffled behind reinforced doors. But he had dismissed them all. He had silenced every officer, every aide, every servitor, until only his own rasping breath filled the dark. His palms rested flat against the altar, no carved marble, no golden shrine, only a slab of battered plasteel draped with the imperial aquila. A guttering candle spat smoke at his side. His lips trembled with words not yet spoken. For weeks he had prayed, not the rote litany of soldiers, not the half-remembered benedictions chanted before battle. He prayed with desperation, grinding syllables into his throat until they became pain more than sound. He prayed because the campaign was failing, because his regiments bled out faster than they could be reinforced, because the enemy advanced with an inevitability that mocked every strategy. He prayed because the Emperor was his last weapon, and he was sure the Emperor would hear. And then the chamber answered. It did not come as thunder, nor as radiant light. It came as stillness. The flicker of the candle froze, the hum of machinery faltered. The pounding of his own heart slowed until silence pressed against him like a hand upon his chest. In that silence, a voice rose, not foreign, not monstrous. It was the Emperor's voice, as the general had always imagined it, deep, resonant, filled with sorrow and with command. "My son," it said. And the general wept. No doctrine in the Tactica Imperialis prepared him for this. He had expected visions, perhaps, dreams shaped into guidance, not words spoken into his skull with the weight of eternity behind them. He swore oaths aloud, his voice cracking. He promised faith, loyalty, blood, and the lives of every soldier under his command. The voice did not rebuke him. It blessed him, and when it spoke orders, he obeyed. At first, the orders were sound. Shift battalions to the western ridge. Hold fire until the enemy's charge broke. Redeploy artillery at coordinates that promised maximum devastation. The general obeyed, and victory followed. The men called him divinely inspired. Camisas recorded his prayers as examples of perfect piety. His officers followed his commands with renewed zeal, whispering that perhaps the Emperor had chosen him as conduit. The general did not correct them. He believed it himself. But slowly, the voice asked more. Its tone never changed, always sorrowful, always commanding, but its instructions grew stranger. One night it urged him to withdraw from a defensible position, leaving men stranded. He obeyed, and though thousands died, the survivors claimed to glimpse visions in the smoked golden light, walking through the flames, guiding them. Another night, the voice told him to execute a regiment accused of cowardice. He obeyed, and though their deaths weakened the line, the army's discipline stiffened, born not of loyalty, but of fear. The general did not question. The question would mean admitting that the Emperor's voice might falter, and he could not endure such heresy in himself. So he silenced doubts. He silenced officers who hesitated. He silenced priests who raised concerns. His prayers grew louder, until every night the chamber shook with his cries, his voice cracking like artillery against steel. He begged for more, for greater clarity, for the Emperor to speak without pause, and the Emperor answered. The voice filled him constantly now, not just in the chamber, but in the war council, in his dreams, in the very cadence of his breath. It whispered to him during meals, during sleep, during battle. It told him which officers to promote, which to execute, which regiments to advance, and which to sacrifice. The general was no longer strategist, he was vessel, and those who served beneath him began to see the cracks. Orders contradicted themselves. One day he commanded a city to be fortified, the next he ordered it abandoned and burned. Supplies were sent into wastelands where no soldier remained. Regiments were marched in circles until exhaustion claimed them, and yet each failure was reframed as test, each disaster as purification. Priests declared that only through fire could faith be proven, Commissars forced men forward with bolt pistols raised, their eyes wild with the certainty that their general spoke with the emperor's mouth. But in the quiet, some saw differently. They watched the general's lips move when no one was near. They saw his eyes glaze, his pupils dilating as if staring into an unseen sun. They heard him mutter words not written in any imperial prayer book, syllables twisting like knives, and when they asked the priests for guidance, the priests averted their gaze. To accuse was to doubt. To doubt was to damn oneself. So the silence spread, and the general's voice grew louder. One night, he led his officers into the command chamber. He placed them before the altar and commanded them to kneel. Some obeyed, some hesitated, but all listened as he began to chant, his voice swelling, the syllables strange, the candle flames bending toward him as though drawn. He demanded they repeat after him. Some did, weeping, convinced they were sharing in Holy Communion. Others bit their tongues, refusing to speak. He executed them where they knelt, their blood soaking the Aquila until its golden wings gleamed red. The voice praised him for it. From that night, his army was no longer an army. It was a congregation. They fought not for victory, not for the Imperium, but for the fulfillment of words only the general heard. When the enemy advanced, the soldiers did not fire in volleys, they chanted. When tanks rolled forward, they did not maneuver, they formed circles around banners and bled themselves onto the ground as offerings. Discipline collapsed, replaced by frenzy, and the war tipped into ruin. Some survivors swore. The general's voice changed in the end. They claimed that what once sounded like sorrow began to laugh, low and patient, echoing through vox channels even when no transmission was made. They swore his prayers did not rise upward, but sank downward, drawn into a pit none could see. And when his army finally broke, when the Imperium's records marked them lost, it was not because the enemy crushed them, it was because the general prayed too loud, and the echo answered back. They began as murmurs in the dark, not sermons, not speeches, only fragments of thoughts shared in hushed voices while others slept. The trenches were loud by day with the crack of lust fire and the bellow of officers. But by night, they became hollow chambers where silence pressed too heavy. In that silence, men and women spoke words they should never have dared, each certain the others would not betray them because the commissars could not listen everywhere at once. And so the shadow of the regiment was born. At first, it was nothing more than a way to survive, a circle of soldiers meeting in the dugouts, stealing a stub of candle from a shrine and letting its light tremble over their hollow eyes. They told each other they had seen visions. They swore that when shells fell, they glimpsed shapes moving through the smoke, guiding them. They claimed that prayers to the emperor felt empty, but prayers whispered into the air brought results. When they asked for rations, they found extra in supply crates. When they begged for safety, the shells fell elsewhere. Coincidence? Perhaps? Yet to the desperate, coincidence feels like salvation. The cult did not name itself. It did not need to. To name was to risk discovery. Instead, it grew through trust and secrecy, soldiers choosing carefully who to invite into the glow of the candle. A look across the trench line, a muttered word, a gesture in the mud. A man would sit, whisper, and by dawn, he was one of them. They did not meet every night, for fear of notice. They gathered only when loss had struck hardest, when comrades lay broken and the silence of grief made men more willing to believe, and always, the message twisted slowly. No one declared open blasphemy. They began by saying the emperor was distant, too high upon his throne to hear the cries of common men. Then they said perhaps his servants, the saints and angels of myth, listened instead. Then they asked if those angels might wear different faces, or speak in voices not written in Holy Scripture. Step by step, faith bent, not broken, until those gathered could not tell whether they prayed to Terra or to something far closer and more intimate. The commissars suspected nothing. Their eyes were sharp for open defiance, not whispers in the dark. As long as soldiers fought when ordered and saluted when commanded, suspicion passed them by, and in this freedom, the cult thickened. Candles multiplied. Charms began to appear, small scraps of cloth tied around wrists. Strange runes scratched into lasgan stocks, sigils hidden beneath armor plates. A soldier claimed the charm on his wrist turned a blade aside. Another said the runes on her weapon made her aim strike truer. Lies, perhaps, but lies with power, because those who believed fought harder. By the time officers noticed, it was too late. The cult no longer hid itself in shadows. It was in the cadence of soldiers' chants as they advanced, in the rhythm of their boots striking the earth, in the way they raised their eyes, not to banners but to clouds, as though waiting for something to descend. The priests tried to drown it with hymns, shouting sermons from battered pulpits, but the words fell flat. The men listened politely, nodded, and afterward gathered again in their corners, whispering prayers that felt more alive. It was during one assault that the cult revealed its true strength. The regiment had been ordered to take a ruined manufactorum, its walls still smoking from bombardment. The enemy was entrenched, and casualties were certain. Yet the cultists walked forward with calm faces, as if the air itself wrapped them in protection. Less fire raked them, but they did not falter. They advanced chanting, their voices blending into a single low hum that made comrades uneasy even as it steadied their march. And when they reached the walls, they fought not like men but like zealots, blades flashing with unnatural speed, hands tearing at throats barehanded. The manufactorum fell that day, but victory did not belong to the regiment. It belonged to the cult. From then on, whispers became shouts. Candles burned openly in the dugouts, shadows flickering across walls like specters dancing. Knives were laid upon altars of scrap iron. Blood was spilled in deliberate cuts. Each drop caught and smeared into symbols none dared translate. The cult was no longer hidden. It was the regiment's second heart, beating louder with every prayer. Those who resisted vanished. A guardsman who refused to kneel was found strangled in his sleep. An officer who reported strange gatherings collapsed during a briefing, his throat slit by a blade no one saw drawn. Fear spread faster than loyalty. Men learned to bow their heads, to whisper along with the chants, to tie charms around their wrists, even if their fingers shook. Participation became survival. Belief came later. By the time the commissars acted, their pistols drawn, their voices hoarse with accusations of heresy, the cult outnumbered them. Inverted banners unfurled above the trenches, dripping with blood. The Aquila was turned upside down, its wings slashed so they curved into claws. Soldiers roared, not for terror, but for names they had no right to know, names that bled from their lips like fire. The commissars fired, but were cut down in seconds. Their bodies were thrown onto the altar, their blood mingling with the candle wax until both flame and crimson burned as one. The regiment was gone, consumed from within. No demonic horde had charged, no sorcerer had cast a spell from the skies. Only whispers, only candles, only knives in the dark. And when the final transformation came, when the cult revealed its true allegiance and called upon powers hidden in the warp, it was not a shock. It was inevitability, for the shadow within had grown too large to hide, and the soldiers who once prayed to the Emperor now marched beneath banners inverted, their loyalty drowned in colors that bled with every step. They were not recorded as dead. That was the cruelty of it. The archives of the Astra Militarum listed them as missing, as if absence were easier to catalog than the truth. Entire companies vanished in this way, names erased from muster rolls. Equipment tallied as unreturned, vox traffic cut mid-syllable. No final words, no last stand, no heroic defiance. Just silence, and silence, in a galaxy this violent, is never empty. It is full of what cannot be admitted. The first disappearance was blamed on the warp storm. A company advancing into the ruins of a city gone black found themselves swallowed by a fog that no wind disturbed. Their Auspex readings failed, their voxlinks screamed with static, and when the storm cleared, nothing remained, not a body, not a shell casing, only boot prints in the ash, stretching onward until they dissolved into nothing. Reinforcements scoured the ground, but the footprints never circled, never returned. They only marched away, as if the regiment had kept walking into some unseen horizon. Others followed. A garrison left to hold a mining outpost stopped sending reports. When a patrol arrived weeks later, the barracks were neat, the mess hall scrubbed clean, beds made, rifles stacked with care. But every helmet was gone, and with them, every soldier. The base felt less abandoned than expectant, as if the men had left only for a moment and would return through the gates at any second. Yet the gates stayed open, and the roads stayed empty, and no one ever returned. The stories multiplied, whispered between regiments like ghost tales told in the dark. A company walking into the warp without screams. A squad standing there posts 1 hour, gone the next, boots still laced in the dirt where they had stood. A convoy whose engines were heard long after its vehicles vanished beyond the ridge. These were not deaths. They were erasures. And erasure is more frightening than destruction, because it leaves the possibility that something still walks unseen. Then the sightings began. At first, only shadows on the edge of battle. Figures in Imperial armor, marching in perfect formation where no reinforcements were expected. Their steps were silent, their banners blank. They did not fire, did not speak, only advanced through the smoke and vanished again. Soldiers swore they saw familiar faces under helmets, comrades lost months ago, eyes darkened and unblinking. Priests called it hallucination, commissaires called it cowardice. Yet every soldier who saw them came back pale, swearing that the forgotten had not died, they had changed. One war zone recorded the impossible. A company of the lost returned in full, armor still marked with the insignia of their regiment, lasguns gleaming with fresh oil. They spoke nothing, gave no sign of recognition, only marched into the city and drove the enemy back with inhuman precision. Their comrades cheered at first, certain a miracle had come, but when the battle ended, when the enemy was slaughtered, the returned soldiers did not stop. They turned their weapons on the very men they had once stood beside. Their volleys were perfect, their discipline unbroken, their silence absolute. And when the gun smoke cleared, they marched away, leaving piles of bodies cooling in the streets. Those who lived called them the forgotten, not traitors, not demons, not even deserters. Something worse. They marched as if memory itself had been hollowed out of them, leaving only the shell of obedience with no loyalty to guide it. Their armor bore no scripture, their weapons no name. Every aquila had been stripped, every oath sigil scraped away. They were not imperial, nor truly chaos, but something between a regiment without allegiance, moving endlessly through war zones, as if following orders no vox could hear. And the more they were seen, the more their presence poisoned morale. Soldiers looked to their brothers and wondered if the same fate awaited them. To die was one thing, to vanish was another. Men clung to their names, carving them into rifle stocks, into armor plates, into trench walls, terrified that without them, they too would be forgotten. Priests shouted litanies louder, commissars executed dissenters more ruthlessly, but nothing could drown the fear that loyalty was not enough to keep a man real. Some whispered that the forgotten were not lost at all, but chosen, that the warp had taken them and refined them, stripping away doubt, hunger, and fear until only the march remained. What soldier would not long for such certainty? No nightmares, no exhaustion, no hesitation before the charge, only the steady rhythm of boots against the earth, forever. It was tempting in its way. Temptation always wears the mask of salvation. When the forgotten appeared again, this time under a blood-red moon, they marched straight through the imperial lines. No bullet touched them, no blade slowed them. Soldiers swore the ground itself bent under their tread, the mud hardening into stone where their boots struck. A few broke from the line, falling to their knees, dropping their weapons, begging to join. The Forgotten did not answer. They simply passed, eyes hidden, steps relentless, leaving behind only the echo of their march. In the aftermath, the officers scoured records. They tried to erase the accounts, to mark them as panic, hallucination, or Xenos trickery. But whispers cannot be purged so easily. Every soldier who had seen the empty armor, the blank banners, the eyes without souls, carried the memory like a scar. They knew the march had not ended. It would never end. And so, in campfires and trenches, when the guns fall silent, men sometimes hear it still. The steady tread of boots in the distance. Not the enemy, not their own comrades, but those who were once both, and now are neither. The Forgotten. The soldiers erased not by death, but by something far colder. A march without destination, without rest, without end. It began with a lasgun, not a cursed relic, not an artifact smuggled from some forbidden vault, just a standard-issue weapon, stamped and sanctioned, passed down the line to a fresh recruit who knew no better. On the firing range it performed as expected, cutting neat lines through practice targets, the smell of scorched ozone clinging to the air. But when the first real assault came, when the trench erupted in fire and mud, the lasgun faltered, not with a simple jam, not with the sputter of a drained power pack. It hesitated, the charge built in its coil, whined with energy, and then released half a heartbeat too late. In that pause, the recruit died, with his shot still echoing in his ears. His comrades swore they saw the beam curve, striking not the enemy but a brother in the line. At first, it was blamed on poor maintenance, on nerves, on the fog of war. But the pattern spread, a heavy bolter that locked its feet at the moment an orc warband crested the ridge, a missile launcher that fired cleanly in practice, yet veered wildly during battle, spiraling into friendly lines as if guided by unseen hands. Men muttered about cursed munitions, about faulty shipments from distant forges. The priests countered with sermons, sprinkling sacred oils and stamping the aquila on each casing. Yet the weapons disobeyed again and again, as though mocking their rights. Then came the tanks. At night, guardsmen swore they heard them growling, engines idling though no crew sat within. Tracks shifted in the mud of their own accord, leaving trails like claws dragged across earth. When battle came, some refused to start until enemies were upon them, their ignition sparking too late, their guns swiveling not at the foe, but at allies. One lemon rust fired into its own command post, obliterating officers in a storm of shrapnel. Survivors staggered from the wreckage, ears ringing, swearing they heard laughter echoing in the engine block as the tank burned. The Vox was worse. A lifeline in war, a voice stretched across fire and ruin. It began to betray the very men who trusted it. Orders were repeated, back-twisted, laced with words no human tongue should form. Advance east became abandon hope. Hold position became hold your brother. Entire squads followed these false commands, marching into ambush, turning their rifles against comrades. Convinced they were obeying, when commanders checked the logs, the recordings played back differently each time, as if the Vox itself enjoyed the cruelty of contradiction. Trust eroded quickly. Soldiers began to doubt every tool, every order. They checked lasguns twice before firing, only to feel them seize in their grip. They glanced at tanks with suspicion, whispering that metal has memory, that machine spirits had turned against them. They looked at Vox units like serpents coiled in the mud, ready to bite with every transmission. Discipline wavered. Men hesitated to fire, fearing their rifles would betray them. Officers shouted until their throats bled, but hesitation cannot be commanded away. Some swore the weapons were not failing at random, they were choosing. A bayonet slipped from its sheath to cut its owner's hand. A grenade's pin slid free, without touch. A lasgun fired of its own accord, striking down a commissar mid-sentence. His last words swallowed by the hiss of vaporized flesh. Each incident deepened the conviction that the tools of war no longer served mankind. They served something else, something watching, something listening. The priests of the Mechanicus were summoned, hooded figures, robed in crimson, their hands bristling with augmetics. They chanted Binharic hymns and poured sacred oils into the cracks of metal. For a time, order returned. Weapons fired, true. Tanks rumbled obediently. Vox units repeated commands without error. But the priests could not stay forever. They departed, convinced their rituals had restored purity. And when the rites ended, the weapons remembered. It was during a night assault that the truth revealed itself. The regiment held the line, less fire snapping through the dark, tanks roaring in coordinated volleys. For a moment, unity held. Then, without warning, the weapons turned. Lasguns spat into friendly ranks. Heavy bolters tore apart trenches. A chimera reversed at full speed, crushing men beneath its treads. The Vox screamed only a single phrase, repeated endlessly in a dozen voices. "You serve us now." Panic broke the line. Soldiers hurled down their rifles, fleeing into the night with empty hands. Some tried to fight bare-fisted, clawing at the enemy as if flesh could resist steel. Others turned their blades on the cursed machines, striking at them as though they were demons in iron form. But the weapons only laughed an echo in the screech of gears, in the pop of discharges, in the hiss of burning circuits. They did not die when smashed. They did not burn when set aflame. They waited, and when the battlefield quieted, when the smoke drifted and corpses cooled, the weapons sat in the mud, gleaming faintly, as if satisfied. In the days that followed, survivors learned a terrible lesson. They feared the enemy less than their own tools. Men fought with rocks, with scavenged blades, with sharpened sticks, refusing to touch lasguns that hummed when idle. Vox units were smashed to silence. Tanks were abandoned in trenches, left to rust with engines still purring faintly like beasts dreaming of their next feast. Yet the war demanded weapons, and eventually soldiers reached for them again. And again, the cycle began. For chaos does not need to corrupt flesh first. Flesh resists, flesh fights. But tools are trusted without question, their loyalty assumed, their silence mistaken for obedience. A man looks at his weapon and believes it an extension of himself. But when that weapon begins to think, to choose, to command, the man becomes its extension instead. And in that inversion lies the genius of the gods. The battlefield turns traitor, not by enemy hands, but by the betrayal of every trigger, every engine, every voice meant to save. And somewhere, deep in the warp, the gods do not roar or bellow. They only smile, for they have learned that the surest way to claim an army is not through the soldier. It is through the weapon he cannot live without. They had marched under their colors for years. The banner bore the sigil of their homeworld, a stylized aquila carved with care. Its wings spread wide above the regiment's name, proud, defiant, unbroken. The men and women of the Astra Militarum knew who they were. They carried their lineage on their armor, painted their units' markings on the hulls of their chimeras, and spoke their battle cries with pride. To be nameless was to be forgotten, and to be forgotten was to die. Yet names are fragile things, and in the warp's presence, even memory can be rewritten. It began in the aftermath of victory. The regiment had driven the enemy from the ridgeline after weeks of attrition, their tanks blazing, their lasguns burning red through the smoke. They buried their dead with ceremony, planting the standard upright in the soil so that the emperor would see their sacrifice. The survivors gathered in silence, saluting the colors that had guided them through the slaughter. But when the wind shifted, the fabric of the banner changed. Not torn, not soiled, changed. The colors dulled, the sigil blurred, the stitching of their name unraveling until the cloth was bare. They thought it exhaustion, the eyes playing tricks in the dusk. Yet, when dawn came, the banner remained blank. The officers panicked. Records were checked. Voxcasters searched for confirmation. But every archive, every data slate, every engraving of their unit bore the same emptiness. Their designation was gone. Their name erased. Even their world of origin appeared redacted from Imperial logs, as though it had never existed. Officers cursed the inefficiency of administratum scribes. Priests muttered about sabotage. But the men felt something colder. They had not been they had been undone. At first, they clung to ritual. Soldiers shouted their unit's cry, desperate to hear its echo. Yet the words tasted strange on their tongues, dissolving before they reached the air. They carved their name into trench walls, but the letters shifted into nonsense before the last stroke was made. Helmets bore fresh paint, but the sigils smeared, refusing to dry, slipping away like wet ink. Slowly, the regiment realized the truth: they could not remember the name themselves. When pressed, each soldier stammered, faltered, eyes darting as though staring into a void. What they had once shouted with pride now rang hollow, lost in their throats. Still, they fought. Orders came through the Vox, stripped of designation but bearing coordinates and commands. They followed them because that was what soldiers did. Yet each battle blurred into the next. Each victory felt strangely unearned, each loss strangely muted. Without a name, there was no record. Without a record, there was no history. And without history, their victories belonged to no one. They bled for a cause that did not know them, and in that bleeding, they began to change. The first sign was on the armor. Achilles flaked from breastplates, no matter how deeply etched. Purity seals crumbled, parchment turning black, ink dissolving into patterns no priest recognized. Vox calls grew distorted, not with static, but with unfamiliar cadences, voices echoing their commander's orders in tones too low, too smooth. When the men repeated those orders, they altered them slightly without realizing, shifting formations, adjusting strategies, bending obedience until it no longer resembled what had been commanded. Yet the altered orders succeeded. They cut through enemies with eerie precision, as if guided by a hand unseen by then. Rumors spread that the regiment no longer fought for the Imperium, not because they had defected, not because they had pledged allegiance elsewhere, but because without a name, they no longer belonged. Reinforcements from other worlds hesitated to fight alongside them. Commissars from neighboring units whispered that to speak their designation was to choke on ash. The regiment marched alone, never stationed with others, never supplied except by crates left unmarked in the mud. Even the administratum addressed them only as unverified, a word colder than exile. The soldiers stopped caring. If Terra did not name them, why kneel to Terra? If the Emperor did not recognize them, why speak his title? At first, these thoughts were muttered in shame, like blasphemies hidden under blankets. But as months bled into years, the shame wore away. The silence of their identity was filled by something else, a chorus of whispers at the edge of their minds. The words were not names, not prayers, but promises. That to be nameless was to be free. That to be forgotten was to be eternal. Their banner returned, but not as it had been. One night, in the glow of campfires, the blank cloth writhed and reshaped itself, not into their old sigil, but into something new, an ever-shifting mark, never stable, never the same twice. Soldiers stared, unable to look away, their lips moving in rhythms they did not understand. They no longer tried to carve their old insignia. They painted this shifting symbol instead, onto armor, onto tanks, onto their own flesh. It was not the mark of the Emperor. It was not the mark of chaos. It was something in between, a lie of allegiance, a mask worn by betrayal itself. When next they marched into battle, they did not chant their unit's cry. They had none. They did not raise their standard in imperial salute. They raised it in silence, eyes empty, steps synchronized beyond discipline, as if puppeted by unseen strings. The enemy broke before them, unnerved not by fury, but by the absence of it. Soldiers without names, without voices, without pasts, only the march, only the slaughter. The Imperium has never admitted their existence. To acknowledge them would be to admit that armies can be erased not by bolter or by plague, but by redefinition. That loyalty can be unmade with nothing more than silence. Yet the stories persist in whispers of a nameless legion appearing where wars burn hottest, fighting until victory is assured, and then vanishing into the smoke. They leave behind no records, no graves, no symbols, only corpses, and the memory of a banner that shifts like breath in the dark. And those who survive swear the most terrible thing of all, that in fighting alongside the nameless, they too begin to forget. First their comrades' names, then their own, until only the battle remains. The campaign should have been impossible. The Astra Militarum had marched into a war zone where the enemy's numbers dwarfed their own, where the terrain was hostile, where every calculation spelled annihilation within weeks. Officers braced themselves for the slow bleed of men and materiel. Priests prepared their sermons for mass graves. Commissars checked their pistols twice, knowing morale would falter quickly. And yet, none of it came to pass. The regiment advanced like a blade through parchment. Enemy lines crumbled with unnatural ease. Strongholds collapsed at the first volley, and ambushes misfired before they could even spring. Soldiers who had never known more than survival suddenly found themselves drowning in victory. They laughed louder than they prayed, drank deep from stolen casks, and for the first time in memory, slept without dreaming of death. Gratitude was the first taste, sharp and intoxicating. At first, the officers attributed it to discipline. Commissars praised the zeal of the men, priests declared it the emperor's blessing, and the generals wrote reports thick with pride. Yet, in private, unease lingered. The victories were too neat, too bloodless. A fortress that should have cost thousands fell after only a handful of casualties. A swarm of enemies broke and fled at the sight of their charge, though no artillery had softened them. Patterns repeated until the victories began to feel staged, as though the foe fought not to win, but to lose. Still, who questions triumph? The soldiers certainly did not. They marched with chins high, banners gleaming, their boots no longer sinking into mud, but striking ground that seemed firmed beneath them. They began to believe themselves chosen, heroes beyond mortality. They thanked the emperor less with words and more with confidence, declaring themselves his favored children. And when the victories multiplied, gratitude blurred into reverence for the victories themselves. It was subtle at first. Soldiers kissed their rifles before battle, not as ritual, but in acknowledgement of the weapon that had delivered them so many easy kills. They began to chant not the emperor's name, but the names of cities they had taken, as if repeating their triumphs lent them power. A company refused to wash the blood from their armor, claiming it was a charm that guaranteed success. Another carved tallies of every fallen enemy into their flesh, smiling as the scars grew thick. These were not prayers of faith, they were worship of triumph, the veneration of victory as a god in itself. And that was when the leash tightened. Orders shifted in strange ways. A command to advance turned into a surge of frenzy, men charging before signal. A retreat turned into slaughter as soldiers refused to withdraw, unwilling to surrender the glory of the kill. Officers found their authority fading, their words drowned out by the regiment's hunger for the next triumph. The soldiers fought not for survival, not even for the Imperium, but for the intoxication of winning. Victory was no longer a means, it was the end. The enemy fed this hunger with precision. They offered resistance enough to inflame pride, but not enough to break it. They died spectacular deaths, scattering under less fire, collapsing in screams that echoed triumphantly across the battlefield. Soldiers began to laugh as they killed, their joy louder than the roar of tanks, their cries more terrifying than any war chant. Gratitude had become addiction, worship had become chains. When the priests tried to intervene, they were ignored. One preached that victory without humility was heresy, and the soldiers stoned him with ration tins until his skull cracked. Another declared that triumph belonged to the emperor alone, but his words drowned in a chorus of men chanting their own names, their own kills, their own glory. Commissars tried to restore order, but when they threatened executions, the soldiers only smiled. What punishment mattered when every day was already a feast of conquest? It was during the siege of the final city that the truth revealed itself. The regiment stormed the gates with unnatural force, the defenders scattering before them like dust. They flooded the streets, killing without hesitation, without mercy. But when they reached the central square, they found no foe waiting, only a vast mirror, cracked and stained, standing where the governor's palace had once been. In its surface they saw themselves, armor blackened with blood, eyes wide with hunger. No banners flew, no oculars gleamed, only their reflections, twisted by victory until they resembled nothing human. Some screamed then, realizing what they had become. Others laughed, pressing hands to the mirror, whispering promises to whatever power had fed them such triumphs. The mirror cracked further, splitting into 1,000 shards, and in each shard a different image grinned back. Soldiers with demons' eyes, with claws for hands, with faces stretched wide in joyless smiles. The regiment had not won. It had been won. When the city burned, there were no reports filed. The regiment did not send word to high command, did not carve new victories into their armor. They marched onward, silent, their banners dragging in the ash. For they had learned the final truth, that victory itself had been the leash, and in chasing its sweetness, they had surrendered their will to this day. Whispers spread of armies that win too easily, too completely. They arrive at war zones, carve through opposition with impossible grace, and vanish before the administratum can log their names. Some call them blessed, others call them cursed, but those who know better understand. Victory is the most perfect chain chaos has ever forged, and those bound to it do not realize they are captives until they are, already marching in lockstep toward damnation. The night was thick with smoke, the kind that turned the stars to ash and smeared the horizon into a single, smoldering wound. The regiment had fought for weeks without relief, their trenches collapsing into rivers of blood and promethium, their bodies reduced to hunger, exhaustion, and the instinct to fire when ordered. No priest's sermon could steady them. No commissar's pistol could frighten them further. They were at the breaking point when the sky opened. It began as a light behind the clouds. Faint at first, like dawn come too early. Men lifted their heads instinctively, weary eyes squinting at what could not be. The clouds burned away not with wind but with flame that left no smoke, and in the void beyond, a figure stepped forward. Its body was fire, its face 1,000 faces, each one familiar. Mothers, brothers, commanders, lovers, comrades, long dead. Every man and woman in the trench saw someone they knew, someone they had lost, staring back at them from the blaze. The regiment fell silent. The bombardment seemed to pause. Even the enemy's fire slackened as if the sight had reached across the lines. Soldiers dropped their rifles, some kneeling, some weeping. The priests cried aloud that it was the emperor himself, descending to guide his children. Their voices cracked with joy, their tears falling freely as they prostrated themselves in the mud. For a moment, despair fled. For a moment, the soldiers believed. The figure raised its arm, and the sky rippled like water disturbed by a stone. Words followed, not spoken, not carried on air, but pressed directly into every skull. You are seen. You are chosen. You are mine." The priests wailed in ecstasy, officers saluted with trembling hands, and the regiment roared as one, voices breaking into a single cry of devotion. Some tore the Achilles from their armor, throwing them into the mud, declaring they no longer needed symbols when they had their God before them. The vision did not fade, it grew. Flames reached into the trenches, not burning but caressing, searing away dirt and blood until the soldiers looked down and saw their wounds gone, their fatigue lifted. Strength filled them, unnatural and exhilarating, as though their very veins now carried light instead of blood. They laughed and embraced, believing themselves reborn, and when the figure gestured toward the enemy lines, they charged with a frenzy no commissar could ever inspire. The slaughter was absolute. Last fire cut through armor like parchment, bayonets found throats as if guided, and grenades landed with precision no training could produce. The enemy broke, not in retreat but in terror, clawing at their helmets as if to rip away the vision that blinded them. The regiment surged forward, unstoppable, singing in voices that blended into a hymn not taught in any catechism. The ground shook with their charge, the air thick with their laughter, and when the enemy was annihilated, the regiment stood victorious, not in exhaustion, but in elation. Yet when the fires dimmed, unease crept in. The figure remained, watching them. Its 1,000 faces shifted too quickly now, flickering between joy, rage, grief, and hunger. Some soldiers swore the face of the Emperor was absent among them. Others swore it had been there at first, but now was gone. The priests continued to praise, their voices raw, but the tone was strained, desperate, as though repeating their faith could force truth into existence. The officers gathered in private, shaken. Their orders had vanished from the voxnet, replaced by a constant hum in the same voice they had heard in their minds. Their tactical maps blurred, formations shifting until all paths led only toward the vision's outstretched hand. They argued, some insisting it was divine intervention, others whispering that it was a lie. One accused the rest of heresy, drew his pistol, and was cut down before he could fire. The regiment's unity began to fracture, even as its fervor grew. Days passed, and the figure did not leave. It hovered above the camp, flames crackling, its 1,000 faces watching without rest. Soldiers stopped sleeping, their eyes fixed on the light. They no longer ate, no longer spoke, no longer saluted. They knelt in silence, waiting for the next command pressed into their skulls. When at last it came, a single word marched. They obeyed without hesitation. They marched into the wasteland, abandoning supply lines, ignoring orders from high command. Vox units screamed with the voices of Imperial officers, demanding answers. But the soldiers heard only the hum of the vision, guiding their steps. Their boots struck the earth in perfect unison, their eyes blank with devotion. They no longer sang hymns to the Emperor. They no longer carried his Aquila. They carried only the fire burning in their minds. Weeks later, another regiment stumbled upon the battlefield they had left behind. Trenches abandoned, weapons discarded, bodies missing. Only the mud remained, scorched with strange patterns. Spirals burned into the ground, as though a massive hand had pressed down from above. At the center stood a mirror of black glass, tall as a tank, reflecting not the sky but a field of fire. And in that fire, faintly, faces shifted, thousands of them. Familiar and wrong all at once. The Imperium struck the records from existence, declaring the regiment lost in action. Yet whispers remain. Some say the army still marches, following a god that was never the Emperor. Others claim they see flames on the horizon before battles, faces in the fire that smile with too many mouths. And those who fight alongside such visions know the truth too late, that revelation is not salvation. It is conquest. To see a god is to serve it, whether it wears the face of the Emperor, or a mask shaped in the warp. There are wars the Imperium insists are finished. Reports are filed, campaigns declared victorious or lost, medals struck, banners folded away, Vox networks fall silent, administratum clerks stamp their seals, and the galaxy moves on. But in the warp, endings do not exist. Every war fought leaves behind an echo, a residue of blood and memory that does not fade but festers. Chaos takes these fragments, reshapes them, and sets them marching again. What the Imperium believes concluded becomes only the opening stanza of another verse. On some worlds, soldiers dream of battles they never fought. They wake with mud under their nails, with burns across their skin, with the sound of bolter fire still ringing in their ears. When asked, they describe regiments long dead, campaigns fought centuries before, as if the war itself has pressed into their flesh. Priests call them cursed, commissars call them liars, but their screams in the night tell otherwise. The war remembered is the war relived, and in the reliving, chaos feeds. Archives are no safer. Data slates glitch, rewriting casualty lists so the dead appear alive again. Whole companies reinstated as if their annihilation was never real. Officers discover reports with their own names signed beneath strategies they never devised, victories they never achieved. To refuse these documents is to invite suspicion. To accept them is to fight ghosts with flesh. Either way, the past bleeds into the present, and soldiers march once more into a war already lost. On the battlefield itself, the corruption is more direct. The soil remembers. Men tread upon plains where battles were once fought, only to find the ground convulsing with images, corpses rising in silent pantomime, banners flapping with no wind, tanks rolling across ridges as shadows of light. These are not demons, not hallucinations, but memory itself given form. Soldiers fire on them, bayonet them, burn them, and still they march, because memory cannot be killed. It can only be repeated. Some regiments have lived through the cycle more than once. They fight, they fall, they retreat, and when the smoke clears they realize they are standing where it began. Weapons still warm, wounds unhealed, comrades staring in disbelief. The enemy rises again, in the same formations, with the same cries, and the battle begins anew. The soldiers scream that they cannot win, but the loop does not care for victory or defeat. It only cares for continuation. The war does not end because the gods will it so, and the gods delight in the repetition, in the endless harvest of fear, rage, despair, and hollow triumph. What makes this worse is not the endurance of the battles, but their distortion. One loop, the regiment remembers themselves as victors, another as cowards who fled, another as traitors who turned their guns on each other. The truth is irrelevant. The memory itself is the battlefield, rewritten with each cycle until soldiers no longer trust their own recollection. They kill not because of orders, but because they must prove the story wrong, only to find themselves actors in another script, written by hands they cannot see. Officers try to resist, to anchor their men with records and rituals. They scratch names into armor plates, carve oaths into flesh, repeat litanies until their throats bleed. But every word is mutable, every symbol vulnerable. By the time the loop consumes them, their Achilles stretch into claws. Their prayers become chants of damnation, and their names are spoken in accents that sound like laughter. They do not know when the change happens. They only know that when they speak, their voices sound like strangers to the Imperium. These wars become footnote skirmishes, lost in the great tide of conflict. Administratum clerks file them away, reassured that the accounts are clean, that the numbers balance, but the warp remembers differently. For every neat line in a ledger, there are 10,000 screams still echoing. For every declared victory, there are legions still fighting in circles of fire, bleeding forever into soil that drinks, but never fills. And so the soldiers never return home. Their bodies may die, their armor may rust, their banners may rot into the mud, but their memory marches still. Some nights, new regiments hear the tramp of boots beyond the fog, voices singing hymns to the Emperor in dialects forgotten by history. They aim their rifles, ready for contact, only to find no one there. Yet when dawn comes, their trenches are filled with footprints. The war has passed through, unseen but not unfelt. A script rehearsed again on ground that cannot forget. This is the true victory of chaos, not the annihilation of armies, not the corruption of soldiers, but the rewriting of the past itself. For what is war, if not memory? And if memory can be bent, reshaped, replayed, then war will never end. It will spiral forever, feeding the gods with every echo, every scream, every false triumph. The battlefield is not ground. It is a page, and chaos writes it endlessly, with blood for ink and lives for words. And somewhere, in the silence after battle, when the smoke clears and the last cries fade, a soldier looks down at his hands and wonders, is this the first time I've bled, or the 100th? Did I win, or did I lose? Did I fight for Terra, or for the whisper that wears his face? The answer does not matter. The war is already beginning again. In the end, there is no silence. Every battlefield lingers, every victory echoes, every loss bleeds forward into the next. Chaos ensures that wars are never truly finished, only rewritten, remembered differently, repeated endlessly. Armies die, but their stories march on, reshaped until even their names are lies. And as long as memory itself can be corrupted, the war will never end. It will only begin again, written in blood across ground that can never forget.